Hello and welcome back to the Stronghold. I'm the Magi, and well, this week's Midweek Magic was an absolutely stellar showcase glimpse into the newly added Timeless format. Every single one of these decks was either an outright meta deck or very strongly based on an existing meta deck or strong card concepts. It was an absolute win here, and they've really come up recently with the showcase events, and I hope that's a trend that continues. At any rate, I thought this was the perfect opportunity to poll the community, pick one of these decks, and then talk about ways to take a meta list and budget it down for those that can't or aren't willing to commit all of the resources in order to build the meta list, but still want something that comes at least close. But before we get into all that, just a quick reminder that the Stronghold is producing content for you across a number of platforms. And Patreon has recently introduced an option where you can follow our content there without the need for any financial commitment. So even if you aren't ready to support the Stronghold is better positioned to support you. So you never miss out on a thing. Now, what were we talking about? Oh yeah, right. All right, so today we are primarily going to be talking about wildcard conservation strategies when we as budget players are looking at a meta deck that we want to start building. And I say start because a lot of times for us budget players, this is a process. People with more dedicated resources can just pull down a list, craft it, and run right on. Sometimes we have to make strategic choices to start growing into a list that we can't build on day one. And while we are going to be talking about one specific deck throughout this video, it's not necessarily wrapped around the specifics for that deck. These strategies can be applied really to any meta deck that you are starting to build as a budget player. So which deck are we going to be talking about today? Well, around here, you matter, and I recently surveyed the community, and Arclight Phoenix was the showcase deck that was selected for more exploration. And I'm going to be perfectly candid here. This is not the deck that I would have chosen. Not only do I have some very specific rules about not building budget decks that are built around a play set of mythic rares, for somewhat obvious reasons, but I also happen to be of the opinion that Phoenix isn't very well positioned right now competitively for either Explorer, Historic, or Timeless. I just don't know that this is the right place to put your resources, but it is the deck we're going to talk about today. And whether this is where you want to go as far as expanding your collection or not, the broader concepts that we're going to be talking about regarding wildcard conservation strategies will continue to apply no matter what deck you're considering. All right, so my first wildcard conservation strategy that I use on every single budget deck is trimming the fat from the mana base. But first, there's only two broad categories of lands on all of Arena that I think are pretty universally worth crafting. The first are the shock lands from the Ravnica block. Really, these are usable in every Eternal format and well worth the wild cards when and if you have them. The second is, of course, the fetch lands recently introduced in Khans of Tarkir. These lands are also really quite good and add so much, even though they're only playable currently in the Timeless format. Regarding the fetch lands, they have recently been confirmed for reprint in Modern Horizons 3, due out this summer. So if you don't already have your playsets from Khans, maybe hold back on crafting complete playsets, because you may pick up 2 or 3 copies on average of any of these from your Modern Horizons 3 drafting and pack opening, and that is going to be the set all summer long. So you are going to have some exposure here, so choose wisely. Now let's get specific about the Phoenix deck. On the left-hand side of your screen, outlined in red, you see the mana base that was presented for the Phoenix deck in the showcase by the Arena team. And as you can see, there's 2 islands, 4 steam vents, that is your shock land. And then you've got 2 Bloodstained Mires, 4 Flooded Strand, and 4 Polluted Deltas. All of those are traditional fetch lands. Really good mana base, 16 lands total. You really don't need a lot of land in this deck. On the right-hand side, outlined in green, is the mana base that I would use to budget down this deck. We're running the same 2 islands, but we've added a basic mountain. Still running the 4 steam vents because, again, I think those are worth crafting as long as you have the resources to do them. If you don't, I would start with just 1 copy if you have to, and then look at your standard playable lands for those is-it colored alternatives. Now, when it comes to the fetch lands, we are replacing one of the Bloodstained Mires with a Wooded Foothills. That gives you 1 additional card versatility in what you have crafted. So like if you are a Brawl player, now you have a copy of Bloodstained Mire and a copy of Wooded Foothills, where the second copy of Bloodstained Mire really won't impact you as a Brawl player. Similarly, we have cut down the Flooded Strands and Polluted Deltas to 2 each. I mentioned earlier how these fetch lands are confirmed for Modern Horizons 3, so crafting 2 makes a lot of sense to get you a foothold in a deck like this, but still leaves some room for those Modern Horizons packs and drafts to play fetch land benefits. Lastly, we've got a Thundering Falls that is one of those current standard playable rare dual lands, and the Katria Triome is in there as well. Both that and the Thundering Falls are fetchable as they have the mountain and island subtypes available to them. And lastly, we have added Fabled Passage into the mana base here as an almost fetch land alternative. And hear me, I'm not saying it's as good as a fetch land, but it is similar in the fact that you can use it to go fetch up your islands or your mountain to help you with fixing your mana and be able to cast your spells in a timely manner. And if it is not played within your first few turns, it can even allow those cards to come into play untapped. Whereas the fetch lands don't necessarily do that unless you're also paying the additional cost for something like the Steam Vents shock capabilities. Now, overall, I would expect a mana base like this to have a 2 or 3% impact on the win rate, just because you are going to get into some of those corner cases where you really needed a specific land to come in untapped or something like that. So depending upon the choices that you make is going to impact how well the deck will play for you. But doing this overall does remove a rare wild card overall and replaces it with a basic. You may have some additional standard playable lands in there to further reduce your wildcard load, and replacing one of the fetch lands with Fabled Passage. Fetch lands, again, can only be played in Timeless and 100 card, don't call it Historic Brawl, whereas Fabled Passage gives you a pseudo-similar capability that can be played in every single Eternal format. So it's not a huge reduction in the wildcard cost overall, but far more flexible. As we move into a more substantial deck tech, we're going to be talking about additional strategies, specifically looking at card availability and substitutions, and in some cases exploring the possibilities and impacts of just cutting back on some cards. Alright, so now that we have talked about the mana base for this deck, I think the next thing that we really need to talk about is card availability. And what I've done here is, well, something I do in a lot of my deck tech videos is arrange the cards by availability. So that first column, the furthest to the left, is going to be the cards that are currently available to you over the last year through rotation, things like that. Then the next column is the low rarity cards, your commons and uncommons that are not available to you within that 1 year rotational window. And then we have your higher rarities, in this case, your rare cards, and then in many cases we will also have some mythics. So let's start by talking about these lower rarity cards. Mishra's Bauble is one of my favorite cards for Timeless. Not only was it available to you in Brothers War, so you might have a few copies of this hiding in your collection that you don't even know about, but it being a colorless card, it will basically fit into any deck. Sorry about the server glitches there, it affects everybody. Next two cards, Consider and Spell Pierce, are really blue staples right now. If you played Mono Blue Control, one of the decks I highly recommend, you're pretty familiar with these cards. You might not have this many copies on that, but certainly things that are worth consideration here. Faithless Looting, this is one of those cards that you kind of got to watch for because there's two versions on Arena. And I'm not saying that the Arena team put the rare version in here to trick people into crafting rare copies, but I'm also not saying they didn't, because Faithless Looting is also available in, what was that, the Sur set, the Shadows over Innistrad, technically from last year, but still pretty readily available as a common. So don't craft rares when you can craft commons. Ledger Shredder, of course, a rare that is from the current standard rotation. This was also a card that was in the jump-in sets last year, so really you might have a couple copies on this, and there's some alternatives that you could do on the Magus, depending upon what else you've got going on. Let's take a look at those right now. While there's certainly a lot of 2-drop flyers that you could slot in here to get similar results, I think the best budget alternative is Fairy Vandal, which has actually been printed on Arena here twice. This allows you to put a +1/+1 counter on the Vandal anytime you draw your second card each turn. It also has Flash to give you a little bit more versatility. Honestly, it's not as good as Ledger Shredder, but it is a lot less wildcard. It is a lot less of wildcard intensive. And of course, the last most recent card put in is from Khans of Tarkir, none other than Treasure Cruise. This one, just being a common, really shouldn't be that big of a deal. If you don't have all of these, if you weren't drafting during Khans of Tarkir or something like that, playing a couple of these and then a couple of other draw spells from Standard is an option, but obviously Treasure Cruise is one of the defining cards for this deck. Now, the low rarity cards here in column 2 is a pretty short list. Unholy Heat, 1 red mana instant, deals 2 damage to target creature or planeswalker. And honestly, if that's all we needed, Shock is in Standard and would make it a viable alternative. However, the reason this card is in here is because of the Delirium. Unholy Heat deals 6 damage instead if there are 4 or more other card types among cards in your graveyard. Excuse me, I inserted the word other there and it shouldn't really be there. So this allows you to take out some of those big creatures in the formats, like Primeval Titan and things like that, for a single red mana. Really great card, highly recommend it, and we're really only talking about a common wild card if you don't already have this. I would say as an alternative, you could go 2 copies of Unholy Heat, 2 copies of Shock. Would 3 or 4 Unholy Heat be better? Absolutely it would, but sometimes every wild card counts. On this next column, we've got 3 rares here in Brainstorm, Dragon's Rage Channeler, and of course the one and only Lightning Bolt. Personally, I don't love Brainstorm in this, but it is a 1 mana draw 3 card spell, so you know, there's that. There all are functional alternatives for this in Standard that allow you to potentially put cards into your graveyard instead of putting them on top of your library, which can have some other synergistic effects. So this might be one of those places that you can trim back a little bit. Let's take a look at those cards. There is really two solid alternatives here. The first that comes to mind, of course, is Curate, another favorite card from the mono blue control deck in Standard. Allows you to surveil 2, which means you can put up to 2 cards into your graveyard, maybe allowing you to dump your Arclight Phoenixes in there, or hit another card type for something like the Rage Channeler. The other one that really comes to mind is Thirst for Discovery. Discard 2 cards unless you discard a basic land card. So again, drawing 3, discarding 2 here can have the benefit of adding additional cards to your graveyard for more benefit. Now, don't get me wrong, neither of these cards are as good as Brainstorm, and if you're serious about the format, eventually you're going to want Brainstorms anyway. But again, sometimes every wild card counts, and you can't spend resources that you don't have, so these are options for you. One word of warning I would say here is another favorite card of mine is Flow of Knowledge. Draw a card equal to islands you control, then discard 2 cards. Looks very appealing, but the mana cost on this of 5 is just way outside what a almost Storm-style deck that you've got going here really wants to be doing. So I would not consider this an alternative for Arclight Phoenix. The Dragon's Rage Channeler, of course, is a staple for the deck. It's actually an uncommon. Why did I put this in the wrong slot? So pretty cheap. There's not a lot of reasons to not have these for your deck. If you're really, really tight on wildcards, you could go down to 3 on this, but I honestly would not recommend it. Getting an uncommon wildcard is really not that difficult, particularly if you're following the plan. You will get there, no problem. That, of course, brings us to a Lightning Bolt here, the absolute stereotype point of the sword for direct damage spells. Again, you can do alternatives here like Shock if you need to, Lightning Strike, but sooner or later you're going to need Lightning Bolts if you're going to be playing Timeless. So as soon as you can, I would go to 4 Lightning Bolts on this deck and never look back. This unfortunately was printed in paper many, many times as a common. It's only available currently as a rare on Arena, but who knows, maybe Modern Horizons 3 might change that, but I don't really expect it to. And of course, the namesake of the deck, the Arclight Phoenix, typically I don't like to build decks for budget players around 4 mythics, but well, this is one of those archetypes that it actually is worth it. And if you've been around for a while like me, you might have a few copies of this in your collection. If the time is right for you to build this deck, spending 4 mythic wildcards on the Arclight Phoenix really is what makes this deck work. You could try it with 3. It won't be as good. You're going to be looking at that giving up 5 percentage points kind of scenario just for that one thing. It is what it is. So either it is the right time for you to build the deck or it's not. I would say spend your 4 mythics on the Phoenix. And I say that knowing that a lot of particularly new and free-to-play players might only get 4 mythic wildcards for an entire budget year. So I really do say that understanding the impact. When we apply some of these conservation strategies to this deck list, we can cut 2 copies of Brainstorm and 1 copy of Ledger Shredder and replace those with 3 standard playable commons, Curate, that are probably already in your collection if you're playing mono blue. Similarly, we are crafting the common version of Faithless Looting, saving us a potential another 4 rare wildcards. We are substituting 1 copy of Unholy Heat for a Shock. And similarly, we are substituting 1 copy of Treasure Cruise for a pre-existing single copy of Thirst for Discovery, saving us an additional 2 common wildcards. In total, when combined with the other strategies that we looked at with the land base, we have cut a total of 8 rare wildcards out of this deck, as well as 2 commons. And while that doesn't seem like a whole lot, when every wildcard counts, little changes like this can allow you to have a deck where in other instances you simply might not. What we did not touch was the copies of Dragon's Rage Channeler, the copies of Spell Pierce, Consider, Mishra's Bauble, the Lightning Bolts, as well as the signature card Arclight Phoenix. Now, my overall impression from running the numbers on this deck is, while you saved 8 rare wildcards, you probably have a deck that is going to run about 95% as well. That means you are going to give up some corner case wins here and there, but again, that might be better for some of us as opposed to not having this deck available to our arsenal. And before we go, I want to take just a moment to thank my totally awesome patrons for supporting me and allowing me to apply my passion into a community. And of course, before we go, I've got some suggestions for your next step.